I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff. I am your Canadian Catholic Communist poetry reader.
Not Matt Bernico, just a Yankee onlooker from the United States over here, wishing I could get some of that over here.
Yeah, well, extremely attainable. You too could come here and read it on Canadian soil. In case you missed last week's episode, we are starting in on an arc exploring poetry, Christianity, and revolutionary politics. And all these references to Canada will make more sense in just a minute. To kick things off, last week we talked about Ernesto Cardenal's exteriorismo aesthetic, a really specific idea about what poetry is, what it should be, and what it does, and the role that poetry played in the Nicaraguan Revolution. Really fun stuff. Cardenal is still my hero. But this week, we are going to take a look at the life and work of the most famous Canadian communist Catholic poet, Joe Wallace. Extremely competitive category. And he won.
That's right. The key to being the most famous of anything is picking a niche that's very easy to be recognized in. For example, the Magnificast is clearly the most famous Christian Marxist podcast out there because, not a lot of competition.
There is some. Faith and Capital, they're out there.
That's true.
Gunning for our number one spot, but don't worry, we're still out in front.
Maybe more popular. I haven't checked the stats. I have no idea.
That would be fine. That would be just fine.
I'm okay being number two.
Yeah. Joe Wallace is a really interesting person because basically nobody knows who he is in the West, but he was like one of the most famous Canadian poets in the Soviet Union and in the People's Republic of China. He, to this day, is recognized as a famous Canadian poet there. You can look up like sculptures of him and busts of him made by Soviet artists. It's really wild, but if you say Joe Wallace in Canada, nobody knows who the heck you're talking about, which is really quite fascinating. I learned about him from talking to an older member of the Communist Party of Canada who found out that I was Catholic, and he said, well, surely you haven't heard of this person, but you should. So he was right. To get ready for this episode, we read a really neat article called The Canadian Worker Poet, The Life and Writings of Joe Wallace by James Doyle. And we also read a very out-of-print collection of Joe Wallace's work titled Joe Wallace Poems. It's an anthology that I bought from the Communist Party of Canada. They still have like 3 copies, so get them while they're hot. We want to explore a little bit of Wallace's life and biography and also some of his poetry to try to draw out maybe some different ideas that he has about aesthetics, very different from Cardenal, for example, and also think a little bit more about the intersection between Christianity and poetry and radical politics. So we'll start on that in a minute, but before we get there, as always, Matt, I've heard you've been hard at work in the Reddit mines, and you've come up with a gem or two. What do you have for us today?
That's right. Yeah, I've got 2 of them, and they're just both so... as gems go, just beautiful,
radiant.
Stunning, radiant, semi-precious for sure. All right, so the first one comes from not reddit.com/r/Christianity, but it comes from reddit.com/r/True Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit truer, a little bit more
That's
Christian
like
than the
good
rest.
stuff.
So here, yeah, it's the good stuff. This is where all the real good youth group boys go to post their posts. Okay, so here it is. It's posted 5 hours ago,
Wow.
so this is steaming hot still. Yeah. All right. Is everyone naked in heaven? God created Adam and Eve without clothes. Sin led them to wear clothes. So, will Jesus come back naked? Will heaven and the new earth be a nudist paradise?
Wow.
Dean, answer this question, please.
We can only hope. Am I right? A bunch of naked church ladies and old church men. I don't know. It doesn't sound like paradise to me, but maybe.
Yeah. The thing is, though, that everyone will have new bodies in the new heaven.
That's right.
So
That's right.
We'll all be slamming tens. You know.
That's right. True. That's a great question. I mean, we know from the rapture, for instance, that everybody leaves their clothes right on the ground immediately. So I feel like it's kind of
that is the first thing I thought about.
It's a real case closed situation here.
Yeah, well, okay. A case closed. Everyone in heaven, we'll all be naked, but we'll all also look like the entire cast of Big Brother. Just a bunch of very attractive young people without clothes on.
That's right.
It's great.
I don't know why. This probably says more about me than anything else, but I feel when I think about art, like medieval art and Renaissance art, and I think about naked people in the afterlife, I always think of hell. There's all kinds of like paintings of hell I can think of with naked people in them. But whenever I think of heaven, I guess I just think of like people wearing robes. I don't know. Again, this is probably just saying more about myself. But there you have it. Some psychoanalysts could tell us.
They're all those naked babies in heaven, though. They're flying around. They got the trumpets.
Well, yeah, but cherubs are just cherubs. You can't sexualize a cherub, Matt.
I wouldn't dare, but I'm just saying they are naked people.
True, fair enough. You got me.
Okay. Yeah, I did. Finally pulled them over on you. Okay, so that was 5 hours ago. So steaming hot and fresh, but guess what though? This one is from 40 minutes ago.
No kidding.
Yeah, I'm getting them hot off the presses.
So.
Faster. Yeah, they're putting them down and I'm picking them right up. So this one's a little bit more difficult, a little bit more challenging for a few different reasons. Okay. So 40 minutes ago, someone asked, my boyfriend said I have a spirit of evil for writing Pokemon fan fiction.
Okay.
So this user writes, I've been dating a guy for 4 months and I've tried hard to adapt his lifestyle. That's the first mistake. I started going to church with him once a week. Even worse. But he found out that I write Pokemon fan fiction and told me I have a spirit of evil and won't return my texts or phone calls anymore. So what does he mean by this? What can I do about it? Dean, what can this person do about it?
Oh my gosh. So, okay, first of all, is this still true Christianity or is this regular Christianity?
Regular Christianity.
Okay, that's a very important distinction.
So we've switched, made a jump.
Because the analogous true Christian response is, I just dated somebody who writes Pokemon fan fiction and they have a spirit of evil. What should I do?
That's right. Yes.
Right. Man, what should you do? You should count yourself lucky that this relationship did not drag on for a year and then you felt pressured to agree to a marriage proposal, because that's what happens in Christian communities. That's how I feel.
That's right. They'll give you a promise ring and it'll all be over. You can't write your fan fiction about Mr. Mime anymore, and it's just you're secluded to a life of no Pokemon, and that's
right.
It's worse than dying.
Yeah, if you want to know what Ash Ketchum is up to, you better stay out of your imagination. You better go to a Nintendo approved source like the TV show to find out what's happening there.
That's right. But Dean, what would you say if this person really wanted to get back with their boyfriend?
Right.
Like how could you overcome? So like, what if you were a teen relationship counselor? What would you say to these two star-crossed lovers?
I would counsel just deep immersion therapy. The boyfriend needs to be surrounded by Pokemon.
It's a good question.
Yeah, surrounded by Pokemon. The TV show has to be on all the time. He's got to want to catch the very best, like no one ever was. I messed that up, and I could tell as the grammar was being put together in my brain. But you know what I'm saying. He needs to be surrounded by Pokemon, and that's the only way to overcome this fear.
I think that's really good. Like, has he even seen Pokemon? It's an important question. You can't say something satanic if you've never even gotten into it.
Yeah, that's what I said about the Ouija board, and here we are.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a lot of good Christian themes in Pokemon. I think that's the thing he's really missing out on.
Oh, it's full of it.
Pikachu is constantly sacrificing himself, like the Christ, for the other Pokemon in the party.
That's right. And there's Dugtrio, a Pokemon that's 3 in 1.
That's right.
I mean, come on. It
doesn't get more Trinitarian than Dugtrio.
That's the peak right there. Okay. What if instead of Pokemon fan fiction, you made it Christian Pokemon fan fiction? It's like, what if Pikachu got saved?
Right. I've heard a Chris Rice song about that.
I think that we just need to all of these questions about satanic cartoons. I'll circle back around to Chris Rice.
They always do.
What would happen? What would happen if Mr. Mime went to church? What would happen if Dugtrio did take the Eucharist? I don't know.
Snorlax, hallelujah.
The only way we're going to find out is if all the 14-year-olds in the world write fan fiction about it. And 14-year-olds, you got to do it. It's your duty.
You got to do it. I feel like that's another good case solved. 40 minutes. It's hot off the presses. Let's only hope that this gets there in the nick of time to save this relationship before it's too late.
Right.
All right. We've done it. We've emerged from the Reddit mines, covered in just the worst shit that you could imagine, the worst kind of coal. And that's a great way to get into some poetry for the working class.
Oh my God.
Here we go. You can't stop it. The train is a rolling. We're going to get to Joe Wallace, his biography in a minute. But before we do that, I feel like we should start with a poem of his. And actually, this sense of humor is good, I think. It's a good vibe because Joe Wallace is a very funny guy. So if last week when we were talking about Ernesto Cardenal, there's a certain humor that peeks through, but it's also very serious. He's a very serious poet doing serious poetic work, etc. Joe Wallace is kind of the opposite. He's like, I don't know, we'll talk about this in a moment, but he had this idea that if you really want to connect with the working class as a poet, you've got to write some stuff that's very accessible, stuff that rhymes, stuff that has a certain rhythm that you could just pick up and get. And boy, does he achieve that, I think. So this is not the cheesiest one, but it is a good one because it kind of gets the themes on the table. So Matt, I'll go ahead and read this, and then maybe you can lead us into the biography afterwards. Does that sound like a good way out?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, you can read it. I'll do a live react, and we'll just kind of get in there. We'll get into the rest of the biography.
Perfect. This is our unboxing audio of this particular poem. So this poem is called Catholics and Communists. It goes like this. I know that differences abound. The one of faith is most profound. But leaving these perforce apart, no barrier reef holds heart from heart. St. Thomas More, to prove my point, I bring two famous men in. Utopia's author, now anoint, would be at home with Lenin. And lately scanning history's page with eyes grown dim from tears or age, this is the vision that I had, St. Joan of Arc at Stalingrad. Snapping. I'm hearing a lot of snaps.
Yeah. Snap. Yeah. Man, it's simultaneously very good and also very silly.
Yeah.
And I love that about it.
It's a great poem, I think. It's actually really good. Like, it's really fun because although it is cheesy, that's kind of a part of it. And I think that's great. But it is also a bit profound. Like, there's all these goofy rhyming couplets. And then by the time you get to the end of it, there's this vision of St. Joan of Arc at Stalingrad. And that's such a cool image, right? That he's trying to bring these two parts of himself as a Catholic and a communist together. And to sort of imagine a saint who is known for participating in, military events, etc. All of a sudden also being on the right side of sort of 20th century history as an anti-fascist, I think is a really neat vision, anyway, to sort of close that poem off with.
Yeah, it's fun, to say the least.
That is the least, okay. You're
right. It's fun and it's good. I don't know. I wouldn't know good poetry if it hit me in the face, so this could be great. I don't even know. Well, okay, so Joe Wallace has a lot of interesting stuff going on in his life. He has a pretty fascinating life being a communist in Canada throughout the sort of 20th century, especially when a lot of when being a communist in Canada was illegal. But in James Doyle's biography of Wallace, he introduces him like this. Joe Wallace's poetry declared Milton Acorn, which is even just too ridiculous of a name.
Milton Acorn, also a workers' poet, should be noted.
Really?
It's
No
true.
way. All right. Okay, I'll try to bracket how funny his name is. Joe Wallace's poetry declared Milton Acorn in 1977 was usually bad, but sometimes totally inspired. I agree, 100%.
I feel that way about this podcast, so that's great.
Yeah, that's true. It is usually bad, but sometimes totally inspired. Okay, the author of 5 volumes of verse, Wallace was for almost all of his adult life a member of the Communist Party of Canada. He was also a reporter and columnist for several periodicals, including 3 major Canadian communist newspapers: The Worker, which was published in 1922, 1936, the Daily Clarion from 1936 to 39, and the Canadian Tribune from 1940 to 75. Besides being an active communist, Wallace remained all his life a practicing member of the Roman Catholic Church, and the interaction between his religious and political loyalties is evident in much of his writing. So even in that first poem, it is extremely evident because it's called Catholics and Communists. So right there to bite you in the face. But that's who Joe Wallace is in a nutshell. He wrote usually bad, but sometimes totally inspired poetry. He was a communist and a journalist and a Catholic. All of those things in one. It's a lot, but pretty cool.
It is a lot and pretty cool. I really love Joe Wallace for a lot of reasons. We'll talk about his biography, which is extremely wild and fascinating. He's one of these characters who I think has kind of, I don't know, he almost like symbolizes many things all at once just by virtue of the life that he led. But in many respects, he's also an extremely normal dude. He's a super committed communist or whatever, but like he separated from his wife at one point in his life. Maybe we'll talk more about this later. But he decided to remain a bachelor for all of his life in deference to the Catholic Church's teaching about marriage. So like a really interesting person in how committed he is to both of these things at once. He's all in for communism and he's all in for the Catholic Church in a way that I think is quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think that the bachelor thing ends up being kind of a litmus test for his Catholicism.
Yeah, that's right.
It shows that he's sort of serious about it. Not sort of, extremely serious about it.
Right. Yeah, and also interesting because it's like a really common, if you read biographies of communists in the United States or Canada, it's actually like almost a joke that a lot of them grow up Roman Catholic because that was an important sort of base for the working class. They grow up Roman Catholic and then eventually they, renounce their faith and they find a new faith in the communist movement or whatever. And the fact that Wallace decided to stay in the faith in his own way is kind of a testament to how important it was because so many other people just, moved on. We should talk a little bit about also, as we kind of get into his biography here, basically why he matters insofar as someone would want to write an article about him, let's say. So he had a pretty strong international importance. Like I said earlier, he was pretty well known in the Soviet Union and China. And here is how Doyle puts it. He says, although Wallace was little known in Canada except among members of the Communist Party, he was probably the most famous Canadian poet in Eastern Europe and China from the 1950s until well after his death in 1975. This lack of honor in his own country is partly attributable to the same political bias that prompted many people in Canada to ignore Norman Bethune until his fame in China forced him on his country's attention. A little bit of background there, maybe. Norman Bethune was a Canadian doctor, a member of the Communist Party of Canada. He went to this fight in the Spanish Civil War. Well, he served as a doctor there and then went to China during the revolution, served as a doctor there, and was ultimately killed in battle. And he's a national hero in China. Like Mao wrote a poem about him. Here in Toronto, there's a statue of Norman Bethune that was funded by Chinese donors, for instance. So he's a huge deal in China, but like nobody knows who that statue is in Toronto unless you're a communist. So there's a kind of analogy here that Wallace is kind of similar to that.
Yeah, it's wild. Norman Bethune too, in China, during like the Mao era, everyone, all the school kids had to read the essay about Norman Bethune. So it's like, he's a big deal.
Right.
But Joe Wallace too, just not as big of a deal as Norman Bethune.
Yeah, I guess.
If it was a contest.
Bethune also wrote a pretty famous poem actually called Wounds, which you should look up. I don't know. We won't talk about it in this episode, I guess. But if you're craving that Canadian communist poetry content, there's one more lead. But yeah, the point about Wallace is really interesting. I think that he had this fame in the communist world and in Eastern Europe and China, but that fame was not enjoyed at all in his home country or country of birth. So we'll talk about how he got there, but really interesting thing.
One more quick plug for people who are not famous in North America but famous in the Soviet Union is Dean Reed. If you guys don't listen to the extremely specific Colorado history podcast, Lost Highways, you should. One of our friends, Tyler Hill, is part of the show, and they made an episode a while back called Rock Around the Block about this guy named Dean Reed, who was like in Hollywood and was sort of like a like the archetypal sort of like pop star in the 50s. But anyways, he wasn't popular at all in the United States, and he like blew up in Chile, and he moved there, and then he just like became a socialist, and that's him. So anyways, I guess all I have to say is to illustrate the larger point that there are all these types of like kind of American or North American artists who end up like becoming kind of interested in revolutionary politics and then like blowing up in those countries, but not in the United States. So pretty wild stuff.
Yeah, that is a really fantastic episode. Also, it's like a good episode of a podcast in many ways, just like good storytelling, but also a lot of really fun songs by Dean Reed, the Elvis slash like early country rock star of the Soviet Union. Yeah, so back to Joe Wallace. Maybe we should start a little bit in terms of his biography at the top, and we'll do kind of a kind of extended dive into his life history, and then we'll read another poem in a little bit. So he grew up in a working class family. He, Doyle says, had an abusive mother, and he tried to run away. And as a result of trying to run away, he got sent to Catholic school. There's a great story about that, which I'll just read here. Doyle puts it so well. He says, when Joe ran away from home at the age of 11, his father deferred to community notions about problem children and had his son committed for a year to a reformatory St. Patrick's Catholic home for boys. Although late 20th century society has concluded that such institutions are as likely to contribute to delinquency as to correct it, thanks Doyle, that's great, Wallace claimed that he profited from the time at St. Patrick's. I got to know boys who are mainly from the slums. This is a quote from Wallace. They were in there for arson, for theft, for incorrigible mooching, and all kinds of petty crimes. But to me, they were just like other boys, good ones, practically no vicious ones, and ones with all kinds of promise. So that also gives you just a look at the extremely wholesome worldview of Joe Wallace. In school, he was apparently known for being good at speaking and writing. He became a political orator, and he got really interested in politics pretty soon after. So a kind of interesting start. He was part of this Catholic reformatory all the way back to his youth, but still kind of held this optimism about the human spirit and the working class or people from disadvantaged, backgrounds.
That sounds about right. I have no idea what incorrigible mooching is, but it doesn't sound that bad.
Dad, give me that money, Dad.
Buy me the Legos. Yeah. Okay. So he was a writer. He was a speaker. He was becoming interested in politics. He kind of like fell in with the liberals in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he was. And there's this really funny, I don't know, Doyle puts this transition from being sort of like a liberal to a communist. This very sort of funny story, again, which it highlights just the wholesomeness of Wallace in general. So I'll read Doyle here again because it's too good. By 1919, his interest in radical politics had been further inspired by the Russian Revolution. During his speeches at political meetings, he found himself heckled by leftists, but instead of trying to blast them or knock them down, he'd say, "You're certainly right," and the effect of that was that they came to me afterward with pamphlets. In 1920, he resigned from the Liberals to join the Socialist Halifax Labour Party, which subsequently affiliated with the Providence-wide organization, then with the National Canadian Labour Party. So this is so funny because it's just like giving speeches, getting heckled by the Bernie Bros or
That's
whoever,
right.
And then he's just like, "Yeah, good point. You're right."
I love too that they're like so surprised that they come to him with pamphlets afterwards. Like you have to imagine they did not expect to be told they were right from the stage.
Yeah, I find I resonate a lot with this. I'm not a super argumentative person, and I feel like if someone just points out how I'm wrong, I'll usually just agree with them. And this would be me. This is how easy it is to persuade me to join your communist party. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. So historically, at that time, the Communist Party of Canada wasn't around yet in 1919, not quite. So the Canadian Labour Party was one among several other groups that were kind of, feeding into what would become the communist movement. And soon after that, he becomes a communist, even down to the point of ending up in what would become the Communist Party. So kind of rushing through here, but there's a lot that we still have to get to. Doyle puts it this way. In 1922, the Labour Party affiliated with the newly formed Workers' Party of Canada. The Workers' Party of Canada was the public front of the Communist Party of Canada, which at its inaugural meeting in 1921 had been established as a clandestine organization in accordance with current policy of the Communist International. Wallace's career as a communist writer now began in earnest when he became a regular contributor of poems, news items, and editorials to the party's national weekly newspaper, The Worker. So he's starting to already have a sort of institutional shift. He's thrown in with the communists by 1922. Also a pretty important year, right? Because stuff in the Soviet Union is really starting to settle down in the 20s, or at least they're not fighting the Civil War like they were. Things are starting to chill out there. The communist movement is really energizing around the world. So it's a big deal that he enters the party kind of in the midst of all that.
Yeah, totally. A couple decades later, Canada passed the War Measures Act, which is not great. It allowed for communists to be imprisoned. So there you go. Joe Wallace was detained and moved around in the early 40s. Although in his 50s and suffering health problems, Wallace was defiant in captivity. On the occasion of an inspection of a camp by a British official, the commandant referred to the prisoners in Wallace's hut as enemy aliens. And then Wallace said, "We're not enemy aliens. We're Canadian anti-fascists." Good one. For his alleged breach of discipline, he was put in solitary confinement, sparking an inmate protest which ended only when soldiers were called in and given orders to shoot if the protesters did not disperse. His first volume of poetry, Night is Ended, was then released in 1942, the same year he was released from prison. So, it's not just like Joe Wallace was like, I don't know, a part of a party that wasn't like important, but it was a dangerous party. It was one that was thought of to be so dangerous that they were arrested. So I don't know, I guess it just kind of lends some texture to the political credentials of Joe Wallace, that he is a communist and one that was willing to go to jail for it, but also a Catholic and one who was willing to remain a bachelor for it.
Right.
I don't know, these things are important, and it's important that we kind of like balance them out, so that you can see that he's committed in both ends. It's not just like one or the other. It's not one is farce and one is serious, but they're both like these serious parts of his lives that he's like willing to really put up about.
Yeah, that's right. I really like too that he's in the prisons when he's in his 50s, which is probably not a great time, not how you want to spend your time in prison. And you can imagine all kinds of people in their 50s probably wouldn't want to be in prison, and you could do all kinds of things to not land yourself in solitary confinement. But the fact that Joe Wallace was standing up for what they believe in and not being willing to be labeled an enemy alien or something like that, but really making it clear why they were in prison, I think is a big deal. And the fact that he's an orator and trying to stir up all these other prisoners, which did end up happening, I think is really, a testament to his commitment to the cause. Most people when they're in their 50s are thinking about retirement in a decade. And Wallace is in prison thinking about how he needs to speak up for anti-fascism in Canada, which I think is a really kind of moving portrait, as funny as it kind of is.
Yeah, definitely. Well, apart from that, there's a lot more to his life. It is, an entire life, so it's hard to get through in its entirety, but here's a few more of the greatest hits of Joe Wallace's life. So he was released from prison in 1942. In 1950, sort of the mid-50s, I guess, he was known as a really prominent communist creative writer. In 55, he retired from work and he dove into writing full-time, and then in 57, He ended up touring the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. In the 60s, the early 60s, he lived in Russia, and that's interesting. In 66, there's this interesting story about how he was invited by the Soviet government as a guest on a summer cruise in recognition of his fame overseas.
Love it.
That's like the that's like the equivalent of like the podcast cruises that people go on these days. You can go see Travis McElroy on this podcast cruise, but in 1966 you go see Joe Wallace on the Soviet cruise.
Soviet poetry cruise.
That's right, with John Hodgman. In 1968, he moves to a retirement home in Vancouver, and in 1975 he dies in Vancouver. So, it's probably also worth saying too that before he retired, he was a factory worker, and that kind of drove him closer to identifying with the proletariat and that whole kind of thing. But so a writer, a factory worker, a poet, all these things. He toured the Soviet Union. He lived in Russia. The cruise, it was great. And then in Vancouver, and that's kind of where his story ends. I don't know. That's his life in a nutshell. I mean, not enough to do it justice for sure. We'll post this Doyle article, and you guys can read it for yourselves if you really want to. But before we move on to kind of some of the criticism and aesthetic thought behind Joe Wallace's work, I thought we could probably read another poem.
Yeah, that sounds great.
This one's called The Bridge. A Catholic by faith, a communist by conviction, and I see no final contradiction. My worries are of another sort. In both respects I have fallen short, and so because of my double guilt, the bridge between us is still not built. Not mine alone, alas, but others. My guilt is shared by both my brothers. So pretty clear what this is about. There's no like deep metaphor or vague meaning. It's just like, look, I'm a Catholic, I'm a communist. Not done great at both at sometimes. The bridge between them is not built. And it's the my guilt is shared by both my brothers is kind of an interesting line too. The brothers of Catholicism and communism together, they haven't been able to bridge the gap. And I don't know, interesting way to work out the Marxist Christian dialogue in a short poem that rhymes a lot.
Yeah, I actually like this poem a lot because it is very short, but some of the lines are just, I don't know, maybe they just resonate with me because I feel sort of seen in a certain way. But that line where he says right in the beginning, Catholic by faith, communist by conviction, I see no final contradiction. And then he says, my worries are of another sort. In both respects, I've fallen short. I love that because it's like, well, yeah, there's, I don't know, people think there are contradictions between Catholics and communists. Not me. What I'm really concerned about is like how I haven't really lived up to both of these demands or commitments. That's the thing that keeps me up, not where these two are apart, but where I haven't been able to, be faithful to both of them, I think is a really moving kind of portrait and a unique perspective.
Yeah, I agree. Well, so you've heard two of his poems. And I mean, he wrote a lot. There's a lot more that you could read, but these are pretty illustrative of kind of his style, I think, right? Like that they rhyme. That's the big thing. They got a rhyme, which is fine. I don't have any problems with that. But they, sometimes are interesting, sometimes have like, some cool meaning, and sometimes are a little bit corny. That's kind of the big vibe, though, that a lot of critics have come away with as well. One of the more well-known critics of his poetry is Northrop Frye, sort of a literary critic who taught at the University of Toronto. There's a good statue of him sitting on a bench out there somewhere. I saw it once. Anyways, Northrop Frye has a lot to say about Wallace's poetry. And Northrop Frye, I don't know. I don't think a lot of things to say about him. But I think he's kind of right, but also a little bit too serious about it. Northrop Frye says this, or I guess this is Doyle relating Northrop Frye's criticism. Northrop Frye described the poetry of All My Brothers, which is this is from a Joe Wallace poem, as written in a familiar communist idiom, sometimes labored, especially in the Yankees Go Home passage, sometimes corny, but sometimes clear and precise, deriving much of its strength from the sheer intensity of the Marxist view of the capitalist world. Okay, so this is Northrop Frye. Okay, sometimes it's corny, sometimes it's not. But listen, it's Marxist and it tells you that.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. And I mean, it's true that sometimes the poetry is labored and sometimes it is corny. But those moments really shine through, I think, when he's giving you that Marxist analysis. And it leads me to think of another thing that Fry said that's drawn out by Doyle as well. So Fry reviewed a later book of poetry called Hi Sister, Hi Brother by Joe Wallace. And he says the book looks at first like naive verse, but at a second glance indicates that a skillful and astute versifier is only pretending to write naive verse. And I think this is actually like a very good insight into what Joe Wallace is up to. Joe Wallace really apprenticed himself to 19th century poets, whereas many other Marxist poets like, I don't know, Pablo Neruda or Bertolt Brecht or other people were kind of experimenting with new forms. And like we talked about last week, Ernesto Cardenal had this sort of modernist drive. Wallace really went in the other direction, but I like this idea that, well, he's apprenticed himself to that tradition and he knows it very, very well, but he's pretending to write naively in a way that, I don't know, tries to draw people in, and then every once in a while he just like hits you with a certain line. And I think that is like, I don't know, it rings true in my reading of Wallace's poetry, and I think it's good for Fry to recognize that subtlety in Wallace's work.
Yeah, I think so too. The pretending to write naive verse is a really confusing statement to me. I don't know, like why is it pretending to write that? What if it is naive verse, but sometimes naive verse is just good? I don't know. I think it's like it's just, to me it seems like a convoluted way of saying something, but that's fine. Northrop Frye is smarter than me. Yeah, well, here's some more from Milton Acorn, another of the critics here. So this is Doyle picking up Acorn's criticism of Wallace. Wallace's failure to achieve fame was his own damn fault, Milton Acorn complained. He published good poems, some stunning ones, but many so bad they made readers never wish to hear from him again. Acorn was not strictly accurate about Wallace's failure since he had achieved fame abroad, but his neglect in Canada was certainly attributable in part to his lack of self-criticism. His failure to achieve recognition from Canadian critics and other poets might also be attributable to his conviction that the most suitable poetic idiom for his purposes was to be found in 19th century verse. Most of his compositions employed the closed forms favored by his 19th century poetic masters. His favorite rhythm was a simple and almost metronomically regular iambic tetrameter. His poems were usually arranged in AABB or ABAB, rhyming quatrains. He did disperse the other meters in rhyme schemes throughout his work, and once or twice even perilously came close to free verse, but he never thought of poetic form as flexible material for experimentation. As he indicated in his preface to The Golden Legend, a book he wrote, he rejected most of the new literary fashions because he did not want to write for poets, critics, and professional intellectuals. His intended audience was the working class reader, and his poems deliberately recall the schoolroom verse that reformed the idea of poetry for several generations of such readers. Okay, that was kind of a long quote and tricky for me to read in some places because I'm not used to talking about poetry and tetrameter. But it's important because it gets kind of some of the aesthetic ideas behind Wallace's work out, right? It is kind of corny and rhymey and, also good because it's not for people like Northrop Frye. It's for people who work in factories. It's for people who work elsewhere. It's for people just to, pick up and read and enjoy and not have to not have to be Northrop Frye to kind of get into.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mentioned Cardenal a moment ago, but it's interesting to compare this with Cardenal's theory of poetry because, Cardenal was doing this really experimental thing. He was trying to do a documentary style of poetry that he thought kind of split the difference, I think, between really avant-garde, weird stuff, but also accessible stuff, right? Like Cardenal said he wanted to write so that he could be read, so that people could understand what he was saying, but that didn't hold him back from experimenting with poetry as a form. But Joe Wallace is kind of similar, right? He writes poems that he wants people to be able to read, but as a result, he goes back to these 19th century kind of poetic strategies because it's also, I don't know, like an easy thing to read, even in terms of the rhythm. It gets stuck in your head. Maybe it's easier to memorize or think about more. Both of them are trying to write for average people or, people for whom the revolution might be meaningful. but they go in completely opposite directions when it comes to thinking about how
Yeah.
you should write poetry.
And it's not altogether like wrong-headed to go that direction either. I'm trying to think of like, my dad. He was like a worker kind of guy. He worked not in a factory, but something kind of like that. And if I asked him to read poetry, he'd be like, well, first, no. Second, if I gave him poetry that was like Ernesto Cardenal, he would be like, this doesn't even rhyme, right? But here, at least, that part would be already kind of finished and done with. So, it maybe it hooks you in because you're expecting a rhyme, and there it is.
Yeah. That's true. And I mean, a lot of Joe Wallace's poems are very funny. Like, we've read a couple of the religious ones for obvious reasons in the podcast, but he has like some really funny poems just about, I don't know, like how rich people think and what they do, or poems about anti-imperialism, or poems about like presidents going to hell and like what the devil thinks about that. And, like he's trying to connect with a certain sensibility, like a regular, not too heady kind of person who's also not an idiot. Like, it's not that he's trying to condescend to the working class. I think he's just trying to be playful with the sorts of like, media worlds that his peers would have been familiar with, right? Like, he dies in the 1970s. So this is a time when people would have read a lot of text and committed poems to memory as like a normal person. So I think that is really fascinating too, right? That like, Cardenal is trying to elevate people to the level at which poetry would become more and more meaningful as the people developed their spirit and their artistic sensibilities. But Wallace is trying to maybe provoke somebody to think differently, or meet them where they're at, and that would be accomplishing kind of a similar goal with a different strategy.
Yeah, I guess I want to make it clear too that Joe Wallace was not condescending.
Right.
He wasn't like sort of stooping down to like, write something for the people, because like some of the things that he would write, were like really smart and clever too. One of the poems that's in the Joe Wallace poem book is called Prayer of the Employer. And it is very funny and very sarcastic. I'll just read the first bit. It's kind of longer, so I won't read it all, but it goes like this. God bless the boll weevil. Without it, cotton would be so abundant. The price would be rotten. And here's to the sawfly that ruins our wheat and keeps us from starving from too much to eat. Many thanks to the fires that daily rise and burn up the surplus of building supplies. So you get the kind of idea, right? That here it's like, God bless all these things that go wrong in the workplace. They make like, workers' lives hell, but for the employer, it's very good because it, creates scarcity or whatever else, So, all I'm trying to say is that he's not like trying to dumb down some ideas. He's like writing very clever things that workers are capable of understanding, I think. So
yeah,
it's good.
That's right. I mean, it's political education, no doubt about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So
yeah,
it's, political education, and it's propaganda in like the best way.
Right. Yeah. The last few sections of that poem we should read too, because they kind of drive this home. He ends that poem saying, "But despite all disasters that aid our enjoyment, we overproduce and cause unemployment. So down on our knees, let us pray for a war that will help some make millions and kill millions more." So again, a troubling sort of parody of how bosses think, but an important one, because that is actually how bosses think, or how capitalism needs you to think, right? And to be able to communicate that in a way that's accessible through poetry, whether it's effective or not, I don't really know. Apparently nobody in Canada knew who he was, but it seems like a good strategy to me anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, it reminds me a lot of Utah Phillips has like a poem called The Boss.
That's
really famous kind of in the IWW I don't know, milieu, but basically it's a really similar type of idea, but it's like from instead of being the prayer of the employer, this is like the prayer to the boss from the worker,
right?
And it's but similar sort of tongue in cheek, using religious language to pull out like why this is so stupid that we think this way, and it's cool.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, Utah Phillips is a good analog here also, because Utah Phillips is also very silly and naive and goofy, but not without sacrificing a good critical edge that makes you think.
Yeah, that's right.
It's almost like these things kind of pull your guard down in a way. like you're reading the rhymes and you're like, this is kind of a cute rhyming thing that I'm reading, and then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, capitalists make a lot of money off of war. Like it disarms you in an interesting way.
Yeah, definitely. So not all of the criticism that Joe Wallace got was bad. Here's a few more uplifting pieces that pull out why Joe Wallace is good, in fact. So this is a quote from Barker Fairley, who painted Joe Wallace's portrait in 1957. Barker Fairley says, not that he was a great genius, but he stood for something, which is not a bad thing in a poet. I'll take it. I mean, if someone ever said that about me, it'd be fine. It'd be good enough. Okay. Also a positive, I guess sort of positive at least. This is again from the Doyle article. He was a fanatic about rhyme. In a day when most poets were a fanatic about not rhyming, Acorn observed, back to Milton Acorn. Not only did he deny poems which didn't rhyme, he thought something was necessarily a poem if he managed to rhyme it.
Me too.
I agree.
I love that.
Yeah, so such an obsession with rhyming could make Wallace's work sound like a parody of amateurism, a mere recitation of discursive lines wrenched into rhyming shapes. All of the critics go out of their way, though, to be like, listen, he just sounds like he's an amateur. He just sounds naive, which is like a really kind way of saying that. But I mean, it's true. It is true that he's not, he's a master of a particular type of poetry. That he like is very learned of, and he knows a lot about it, but it's funny that they just have to keep reiterating like, this sounds like he doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean, I love it because he's like, this guy is the dad joke of communist poets.
Yeah, that's right.
Like
someone's got to do it.
You hate dad jokes, but every once in a while you hear one and you're like, well, that one's pretty good though.
You hate propaganda, but every now and again you're like, yeah, this one's a good one.
Well, let me read one of my favorite poems, and we can talk about that a little bit as we sort of come up to the end here. So this is a poem called Do You Believe in Man? Here's what he says. But when they got to heaven, to their astonishment, there was Nikolai Lenin, and right in his element, finding there the classless world that filled his life with fire. From every man the best he has, to each his heart's desire. Lenin in his leisure hours does the things he'd like, stops and swaps a rebel yarn with his friend St. Mike. Each one telling in his turn, it doesn't matter which, the hot foot he gave Lucifer, the burns rush to the rich. And when they have a round or two, if Mike begins to prod, by slyly asking Nikolai if he believes in God, Lenin on the table spreads the latest 5-year plan, and just as slyly asks St. Mike, do you believe in man? I love it. It's perfect.
That's a good one, though.
It's a great poem.
That's the good one. It's cool. It's cool and clever and good, and it rhymes. And those are the things I need in a poem.
That's great. I like this poem a lot for a lot of reasons, but that end just hits the rest of the notes so well, I feel. That idea that, it's Michael the Archangel and Lenin hanging out in a bar, and they're drinking, and Michael the Archangel asks Lenin if he believes in God while they're in heaven is also already like a very funny scene. And then Lenin putting out like a big blueprint of like the economic planning of heaven and asking Michael the Archangel if he believes in the power of humanity is just such like a perfect image. I don't know. Again, maybe I'm just like, I feel seen here or something, but that just feels like what's happening in my brain all the time.
Yeah, the same thing's happening in my brain, but also they're both naked because they're in
They're
heaven.
right. Of course. And they're both tiny. They're both little babies, fat babies, cherubs.
That's right. Cool. Well, what do you think we can take away from Joe Wallace and all of his very good poetry?
Well, I think a few things. As I've thought more about Joe Wallace this week, I feel, first of all, I think it's cool that he really throws down the gauntlet about sort of mixing what you might call low culture or accessible arts with really profound ideas, like pulling together politics and religion in a way that actually communicates something pretty unique, I think, and really significant. That's very cool. And also the fact that these poems are done in such a almost formulaic way and with such an accessible feeling to them, I think is encouraging too, because the idea that Joe Wallace is sort of expressing is like anybody can write a poem about the working class. All you got to do is write AB on a sheet of line paper, and like you're off to the races. Just make them rhyme, and you've got it. You've got a poem. They can suck. Northrop Frye will tell you they suck, but every once in a while there's one that's very good, and I love that. Like that makes me feel confident. Maybe I will one day write a poem.
That's right. Usually bad, but sometimes totally inspired is great. I agree. I think that's cool. It's definitely a different approach to the creation of political art than Ernesto Cardenal. It's not creating a new human, right? It's not creating a new society necessarily. It's definitely like, I don't know, it's making something though that is on the way. Like it's the bridge that maybe you're not going to live up to, but it's on the way to the new society.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, too, to think of this as Joe Wallace is writing poetry in a society that is not even close to a revolutionary moment in Canada.
Right. Yeah.
And he's going to other societies, right? He lives in Russia for a couple of years. He's aware of where it has happened, but like he's thinking about Canada, and he dies in Canada. And that is a very different context than writing poetry in a place like Nicaragua, even before and after the revolution. And it makes me wonder, how much of that is also really important to think through when you consider maybe the differences between someone like Wallace and Cardenal, like why they would feel motivated to write in the way that they did.
Yeah, totally. That's a good point.
I did it. In the next couple of weeks, we are going to have some real life poets to come on the show and tell us actually meaningful information about the connections between poetry and Marxism and Christianity. But hopefully this has been kind of a helpful foundation or groundwork for it, thinking about these two poets, Cardenal and Wallace. I don't know, Matt, is there anything that you are super pumped about thinking about with respect to poetry?
Like I said last week, I don't know a ton about poetry, and I'm terribly underread in that area. But learning about sort of the the political and the pedagogical parts of poetry, I think are really interesting. For Cardenal, it was like imagining a new world that you could live in now that the revolution has happened there. And for Wallace, it's like giving a type of political education to workers through the means of poetry. I think that's a really cool thing. Both are propagandistic in a way, and I think that's really interesting. I think propaganda is good, and in the form of poetry, I think it's particularly powerful. So I'm into it.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Well, I guess we'll come around to it all again next week.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can find us on Twitter at the Magnificast there as well. We're on Facebook. We have a group called the Magnificast Basement. Let me think. Oh, dang. We should have mentioned this at the top of the episode. Maybe we will mention it again later. But Sarah New, who's been on the show in the past, wrote a neat article at Religion and Politics where she mentions our podcast and other Christian socialists. So many thanks to Sarah, and you should read that article if you haven't. Our music is, as always, by Amoria Armstrong, and our outro is by the Illogical Spoon. See you next week.
Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late.